Hello, welcome today. My name is Yasmin Green. I am the Head of Research and Development for Jigsaw, which is Alphabet's think tank and incubator looking at global security challenges. I am very excited to introduce, as our guest speaker today, a longtime friend of Jigsaw, formerly Google Ideas. I wanted to actually share a personal tidbit. The day before yesterday, I was talking to my husband about our shared beliefs. Like, other people describe their religion as Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Scientology or Orthodox Freudian or whatever. And I was like, how would I describe what our shared belief system is? What kind of shapes our behaviors and our values? And we decided that we're going to write out kind of our version of the Ten Commandments, so the imperatives that govern us not just spiritually and morally, but also political, societal, technological. And I realized that there was so much in there that is broader than what we necessarily think, or what we conventionally think of as to do with religion. I think that's a good segue to introduce Parag Khanna today, because he is bringing together those factors, these multidimensional factors, and reimagining things that really around our world order and our governance system. And he's kind of reimagining our future with a much more nuanced and complex framing than we're used to. So I will introduce him. I'll give you a little bit about his bio. Parag is an international relations expert, intellectual, best-selling author. He has just written a book called Connectography, Mapping Future of Global Civilizations, and we are very fortunate to have some copies here at the back. So go and collect yours on your way out. Parag is CNN's global contributor, a senior research fellow at the Center in Asia and Globalization at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, co-founder and CEO of Hybrid Reality, which is an advisory firm looking at the policy implications of the policy and economic consequences of emerging technology, and the co-founder and CEO of Factotum, a boutique content strategy agency. Many of you may have seen a TED Talk by Parag or read one of his numerous op-eds in the New York Times. You are unlikely to have read his book already because it just came out this morning. So I thought we'd structure today with Parag giving us a short presentation on some of the key themes of his book, and then we will sit down and have a conversation and have some Q&A. So without further ado, Parag.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone here in New York and at the Googleplex out there. I'm told I should look at the camera a little bit as well. Thanks to all the friends for being here. Thank you, Yasmin, a dear old friend indeed. And it's nice to see just how enormously, exponentially this office has grown. And congratulations, of course, on becoming Jigsaw and all the great things that you're doing. So we were having a little conversation earlier about how to structure this, because even if you haven't read the book yet, you've probably seen it over there, and you see that it's about 500 pages long. So I have a presentation lined up here, which almost, it's so heavy in megabytes it almost toppled the computer over. And so you get to vote. Do you want lots of text and notes and data, or do you want lots of pretty pictures? Pretty pictures, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, pretty pictures. I think that'll be good for the audience on the West Coast as well. So I'm going to speed through the thesis of the book and just give you a flavor of things by way of talking you through some of the maps, because the maps are really the crown jewels of this book. What you'll find is that we have 2 map inserts in the book, and almost as much effort went into producing those as into the 120-something thousand words of the book itself. Perhaps it was so long because it's the completion of a trilogy. The first couple of books actually I presented at the other Google office, at the Googleplex, doing authors at Google there. So here I am fittingly on the East Coast to launch the completion of the trilogy. So we had to pack a lot into this final book because there won't be any more after this. So get this one now. I'm done. I've got nothing left to say. But there are lots and lots of maps that really help you explain the 21st century. And I want to just emphasize that all the maps in the book and that I'm going to show you today are completely bespoke and unique. You've never seen them anywhere else, and they are from an objective standpoint, because I didn't make them. I helped to just design and strategize them. But they are, objectively speaking, having now looked at a whole survey of global cartography, they're the best maps you will ever see, ever. About the geographic and infrastructural world. So I consider them, as I said, the crown jewels, and I'm going to talk you through some of them. So the first is this. This actually isn't from the book. This is a screenshot from my TED Talk from a few weeks ago, in which I really talked about the global connectivity revolution, which is also the thesis of the book. It's effectively saying that all of the maps that hang on your walls and our walls, I accuse them all of being completely wrong and biased and misleading, because they always show us the political boundaries as the primary lines. They tend to ignore completely infrastructural lines. And yet the irony being that we have 150 times more mileage of infrastructure than we have mileage of borders. We have less than 500,000 kilometers of borders between countries, and we have something on the order of 75 million kilometers worth of what you see here, which is highways and railways, so transportation, oil and gas pipelines and electricity grids, which is energy, and of course, internet cables, communications. And that's just the beginning. This revolution that I'm talking about already utterly overwhelms in terms of how it unfolds itself on the map of the world. It actually totally overwhelms our political divisions. And yet we're just in the early phases of building out the planet through these transportation, energy, and communications infrastructures. So I like to cite Autodesk, the design engineering firm that says that we'll build more infrastructure in the next 40 years than we have in the last 4,000 years. So this revolution is just underway. The spending that we're going to put into this amounts already to $4 or $5 trillion a year, which is double what we spend on all the military and defense establishments in the world. So I think that this is the beginning of a great a great shift in the world, and I wanted to set out to map it. And I believe that it requires, if you really take this this infrastructural development to its logical conclusion, you literally have to reimagine how life is organized on the planet Earth. We always think of ourselves, we're raised and trained in this epoch, since the 17th century basically, to think of ourselves as being organized according to countries. Who you are is where you are, and where you are is in a country. And your identity, therefore, is that national identity. And I really want to push the envelope here and say that, in fact, we are organized much more according to our infrastructures and our supply chains and our cities. So instead of nations and borders, we live in a world of infrastructures, cities, and supply chains. And those matter and shape who you are, what you do, and your potential outcomes in life way more than just what your national identity is. And that contradicts the oldest adage that we know, that all children learn in school, which is that geography is destiny. And I'm arguing that's not true. I'm arguing that connectivity has now become destiny. Connectivity is a lifeline. It's an opportunity, and it also creates multiple sources and possibilities for your identity in ways that we're just starting to appreciate today. And this infrastructure, what's so fascinating from an engineering standpoint, there's a term that's little used that I think is going to become more prominent these days, and it's topographical engineering. And so I actually opened the book with a travel around the world. Imagine that you could travel around the whole world without leaving the ground. And you can do so through all of the new railways and very large floating structures. There's an acronym VLFS in the field of oil and gas engineering. We're building these floating oil rigs that are larger than the Sydney Opera House. Even cruise ships that size. We're infrastructurally able to modify the Earth. So you're familiar with this term, Anthropocene, right? This age in which mankind's impact on the ecology on the planet becomes so systemic that it changes the nature of the global environment. And how have we done that? We've done it through this incredible revolution in our durable engineering capability. So we're physically constructing and reconstructing and modifying the Earth through all of this infrastructure. And all of those infrastructures are so much more durable than our nations and states and boundaries. As I point out repeatedly, we've had cities. Cities are the infrastructure that you can see from space, right? You can't see countries and borders from space. You can see cities. You can even see railways now. You can see tall buildings. You can see all sorts of man-made things. You can't really see borders. They're actually much more artificial than the infrastructures that we build. And cities outlast every empire and every country that nominally governs them, right? We have had cities for 5,000 years. We've had Baghdad, we've had Constantinople, now Istanbul, and we've had Beirut and Alexandria and so forth. The countries that seem like they are the bedrock of our international system legally are actually fairly insignificant in comparison to the long histories that our cities have. And now the connectivity between those cities is becoming so robust that we are becoming what I call a global network civilization, not a world in which states and the relations among them actually govern, actually operate the system. It may seem like that if you look at an organizational chart of the UN, but because you're looking at an organizational chart of the UN, you think that that is how the world works. If you look at the world itself, what you would see is, from the outside, you would see, you would be seeing this, right? This is the real world. This is how the world actually works, not the way institutions are structured. And this is truly global. We've never lived in a world where world trade is so all-encompassing and where all of the continents are included in that system on relatively equal terms. You could have, obviously, in the colonial era, you had the dominance over developing countries in the southern hemisphere by a few European empires. Today, you don't have that. Today, you have these growing, dense, continental economic systems that are increasingly tied to each other by infrastructure and by supply chains. The same thing is happening in capital markets. So what it means is that this world of nations and borders is much more one that I call a supply chain world. And it's a world that some describe, the physicist Michio Kaku calls it perfect capitalism. In a world where everything is totally connected, you unite all of these historical forces that economists and sociologists have been talking about for hundreds of years. You bring together Adam Smith's free markets, David Ricardo's comparative advantage, Emile Durkheim's division of labor. Durkheim is my favorite. Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard, who talks about the complexity of production. And you can achieve what economics is really all about, which is the optimization of land, labor, capital, and production. And of course, you do so in a way that isn't organized according to territorial political units, but anywhere where you want to produce something, you can do so. So like I said, I want to get more into some of the maps, and I want to talk about what this supply chain world of total connectivity looks like. Well, it's a world, in fact, where we have very substantial mobility of people. Globalization, and this is a book about globalization, is ultimately all about people. The history of globalization begins with mankind's wanderings out of the African continent 60,000 some years ago, and it hasn't stopped, obviously. It continues unabated. So today's headlines are dominated by Donald Trump wanting to put up a wall, or European populist politicians talking about wanting to close borders. But the fact is that that is a reaction to the enormous amounts of migration that have taken place and continue to take place. That is not the reality of closing borders or of pushing migrants back, because that actually hasn't happened. Europe let in 1 million migrants in the year 2015, more than ever before. So that's talk. The reality is this enormous expansion of migration, such that there are 230, 250, some say 300 million people today living outside of their country of origin. They might be even permanent expats. And little do many people in America realize that there are more American expats, I'm one, than ever before. 9 million Americans who live outside the United States. That's more than double what the kind of normal standard sort of amount has been over the last 10, 15 years. So it's all shot up. So we've become a world, if you will, of global economic migrants. Everyone is wandering either from the countryside into cities, across borders, from one city to another city, in search of a better life, in search of economic opportunity. But it continues unabated, and I will put my money on this continuing, because in a supply and demand world, rather than a nations and borders world, countries actually wind up thinking pragmatically about what their needs are for their economies, what their demographic needs are. And the same places that are talking about putting up walls and borders are the places that actually most need immigrants, right? countries with aging populations, like in Europe and the United States. So I think that we need to differentiate between the short-term populism of politicians and the long-term realities of a world in which connectivity facilitates migration, more passports have visa-free access around the world. Again, there are going to be more frictions. We can see that happening right now with what the legislation that Congress has passed. There are more frictions, yes, for security reasons. Smart, sensible frictions are not a bad thing. They help to prevent everything from pandemics to terrorists from entering a country. But by and large, those frictions don't slow the overall pattern of migration flows. So this is another way of rendering it and showing just how many people are moving around the world within and across and amongst the continents. And it shows you not only how important it is, how systematic it is demographically, but how important it is economically in terms of the values of the remittance flows. And so there's an enormous two-way benefit, of course, to global migration. Some economists argue that you could double world GDP by lifting migration restrictions, and I think that may not be too far off. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I don't want to take too long, but I want to show you some of the maps that I think are more accurate representations of how humanity is organized. And this is one of them. What's captured on this map and not captured on any conventional map that hangs on your walls is quite a few things. First of all, you can actually see people. You don't just see artificial states and boundaries. What you see is every single human being on the world is on this map, right? And yellow being the most dense geographies. Then, most importantly, you see in the dotted ovals show you the most or the largest or most economically significant urban clusters. So you see Silicon Valley there, and of course this northeastern megalopolis where we're the midway point here in New York between Boston and Washington. You can see the clusters like Sao Paulo or Johannesburg, South Africa, Lagos, Nigeria, and so on and so on. And you can also see just how they are not only the most important anchors of their national economies, but even entire regional economies depend on just a couple of cities. So shown a different way, this is the projection until the year 2030. I looked at the data or projections by the World Bank, by the United Nations, all sorts of organizations about what are the main megacities that are emerging either today or in the next 10 to 15 years. If you want to be a megacity in the year 2030, you would actually already have to be well on your way today, right? So we can say with some certainty that this is not only the map of today, this is also the map of 2030. I don't think in the year 2030 I would need a different PowerPoint slide, than this, because this is already the areas with the most dense concentrations of populations in the world. And these cities are so significant, again, economically, that I think if you want to understand the map of the world in the 21st century, you're much better off just looking at these cities and the connections between them to understand how the world really operates. So I coined this term, connectography is one coinage. By the way, no one says it with more beautiful accent than you, Yasmin. But the other term that I come up with in this book is diplomacity. The diplomacy among cities is ultimately more revealing about how the world operates. Think about mergers between stock exchanges. Think about nonstop flights connecting any two cities in the world. It seems like Emirates Airlines wants to link, wants you to be able to fly around the world nonstop. They're flying now to Panama City, to Auckland, New Zealand, pretty soon to Sydney. So, this sort of point-to-point travel, obviously the data networks and internet cables linking cities and so on, you find that the relationships among cities tell you, almost most of what you need to know in a way about the day-to-day reality, certainly of the world economy and world society. So how did places get there? We often think of economic growth as just an accident or a byproduct of demographic expansion and so forth. But in fact, over the last 50 years, what countries have started to do is to strategically urbanize, not just accidentally urbanize. And they do so by creating these special economic zones. So what I've been tracking is how in the last 50 years, we've grown from a world of 3 or 4 or 5 experimental special economic zones like Mauritius or the Dominican Republic, or sort of factory towns and industrial parks and clusters clusters within them. And of course, Shenzhen in southern China. Now you have 4,000 of them. So you want to understand, how did a country grow so? How did Vietnam get to be Vietnam? How did Vietnam go from being, the country that was that obviously was so heavily bombarded and fought against the United States in the Vietnam War, to what it is today, which is considered the next China industrial powerhouse, the Germany of East Asia? How did that happen? Well, it happened because they copied the China model. They designated dozens or hundreds of these industrial parks and special economic zones. They started attracting investment in supply chains and technology. They started moving workers there and training them and ramping up their exports. That's how they did it. And that's what country after country is doing around the world today. And like I said, there are 4,000 such special economic zones. So they're not on our maps, which is another reason why our maps suck. So I have a line in this book where I say I've spent the last 5 years going to places that apparently don't exist, because I don't know why they're not on our maps, but the locus of economic activity in most of the world's emerging economies are these cities and special economic zones that don't even make it onto the maps, and yet they really should. So what I've done is to insert them visually in a number of maps in the book. Entire countries are reorganizing themselves around urban clusters, and even the most ancient civilizations in the world, such as China, that have millennia of unique cultural and provincial and linguistic histories, are saying, wait a minute, in order to be viable and competitive economically, we have to not just have this kind of historical, cultural sort of geography, but instead we need to have a strategic urban geography of highly populous, dense, economically productive, and connected economic and urban zones. So in the New York Times this weekend, there was a two-page map that I worked with them to produce that talked about how America should do this. The United States should literally reorganize itself around 7 or 8 mega regions that have similar economic profiles, around the white zones, which are the kind of urban hubs that either are between or in the heart of those regions, that are their kind of financial and demographic and infrastructural centers. And then the lighter lines are the high-speed railway networks that would connect those cities together. So you would move from the United States of America sort of towards the United City-States of America. Now let's bear in mind that I actually softened the argument for fear of the backlash against it, but the feedback on this has been so positive that I wish I had gone back and doubled down on the argument in the op-ed and said, actually the 50 states are literally pretty useless other than for what's happening right now, which is collecting electoral votes. But after that, after you've won this primary or that primary and made it into the White House, what does that mean for the competitiveness of the entire country that you have to govern? And it turns out the 50 states mean absolutely nothing. And they are certainly cause a lot of friction. I've gotten so many emails from people in the last 48 hours saying, damn right, I live in the tiny state of Rhode Island where we have 30, 40 counties, and we duplicate our education and our sanitation and all these layers of bureaucracy, and all that does is waste money on politics rather than on productive commercial activity. So I feel even more strongly about this than I did, sort of 4 days ago. Before this was published. There's a lot more to say about this, not only here, but also in the book. So more of the remapping. I want to point out the entire world is remapping itself. Region after region is building infrastructure across borders, such that if you were to map that, you would get a totally different appreciation for how entire continents operate. So this is my map of the North American Union, in which you can see that the United States gets electricity from Canada. There's all of these railways and energy and pipelines and freight railways between Canada and the United States. The U.S. is investing heavily in the Mexican energy system. It's doing joint production of automobiles in Mexico. San Diego and Tijuana now share an airport terminal. All of these things, and eventually the United States is going to need more and more Canadian water. I'm not sure the Canadians don't really love this idea, but there's one, the token Canadian. It's not about an invasion. It's very okay. I would say statistically it's about right. The point is that in a world, actually, I'm going to show. Let me even fast forward a little bit and get right to it. But some of these maps show you. So Southeast Asia, is graduating from this post-colonial geography of 10 different countries into one that, again, is densely infrastructurally connected the way that Europe is. Africa, the pathway out of that scarred colonial map of Africa, where with borders organized according to latitude and longitude, is in fact to build more connectivity so that African countries can more seamlessly export their goods together and scale their economies. That, I think, is a very important pathway out of thinking about sort of the future of the Middle East. You have the spectacular collapse of the modern Arab state. It didn't last very long. And the post-colonial decay of countries that were born out of the French and British Empire in the 1940s has kind of been an obsession of mine for a long time. It traces its way through all of my books, and this is finally a time where I say, okay, so what comes next? What do you do in the post-Arab Spring? You can't really pretend that Iraq exists or will exist again. You can't really pretend the same for Syria or for any number of other countries. But let's go back to the fact that the cities of the Mesopotamian region, the Middle East, are the oldest cities that we have in the world, and they're continuously functioning, and they have that relative degree of stability that states don't have. So I see the Middle East as capable of, it certainly has the money to do so, capable of building itself into a connected inter-urban sort of system. And I hope that that's where the investment from the outside and from within the Arab world can go. So I just want to, the geopolitics we can talk about with Yasmin, because that's a specialty of hers as well. This is one of my favorites. I'm going to show you one or two more. This is, 5 billion people or so, give or take, are on this map, right? Most of the world's population is in Eurasia. Just India and China alone, to say nothing of Southeast Asia and the Middle East and so forth. You've got literally almost 5 billion people. So this is Eurasia, Eastern Eurasia is a world unto itself. And you certainly heard in 2015 about the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which is going to be putting up $150 billion and more, with many countries participating to build infrastructure across Eurasia. And in fact, that process already began 25 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. And ever since then, China has begun this process of building railways, highways, pipelines, electricity grids, water canals, and so forth to link up Eurasia. Now, why is it doing that? Well, China has more neighbors than any country in the world, right? China has 14 neighbors. It doesn't want to fight a war with any of them. In fact, every neighbor of China is suspicious of China for good reason. So what China does is, I like to use this analogy from the construction industry. It's going to build, own, and operate its neighbors. What do contractors do? They build, they own, they operate. So China isn't going to invade its neighbors because that will obviously heighten tensions even further. But it's just going to build its way across them, and it's going to do so to achieve this supply chain world. It's going to smooth the inflow of commodities and raw materials that it needs, and it's going to smooth the outflow, the export of the electronics and other goods that it manufactures. And to do so, it's infrastructurally reorganizing all of Eurasia. So the lives of 5 billion people are being touched by this Chinese activity that began 25 years ago and is accelerating every single year. So I think of this, AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, I think of it as the NATO of the 21st century. And that's instructive because we think of security as being the world's paramount public good. The United States is the foremost provider of it, especially since World War II. But along comes China and says, well, there's another global public good as important as security. It is infrastructure. It is connectivity. Every country seems to want it because 60 or 70 countries lined up to join this bank as soon as it was established. And China is going to be the world's largest provider of this. So the NATO of the 21st century is the AIIB, and it's a world in which people want that, they crave and need that connectivity and that infrastructure as much as they want security. So another couple of maps. Aha, this one. This is another one that Canadians may not like so much, or they may find interesting. I mean, if our climate change projections are correct, and this is a map that was made by the British journal, The New Scientist, they said if the world temperatures rise to 4 degrees Celsius above the 1990 baseline that the IPCC uses, where will the world's food production be? And so what you find, if their sort of extrapolation is correct, and the impact that this temperature rise is going to have in terms of wiping out the food production in what are today some of the world's most significant bread baskets. The world's largest food producers are the United States, Brazil, India, China, Australia, and a couple other countries. So notice those countries are all now a sort of pasty brown. They've all been desertified, if you will. And food production will happen in areas that have traditionally been, sort of tundra in the Arctic, which is to say Canada and Russia. But what are the two largest countries in the world and two of the most depopulated countries in the world? Russia and Canada. So here you have a situation where the geography of the world's population today, which is almost everyone south of the Arctic Circle, 66 degrees north latitude. Do you know how many people live north of the Arctic Circle ring today? It's less than the population of Manhattan, right? It's less than like 4 million people live in the entire Arctic Circle. And yet we're heading into a world where most of the food is supposedly going to be coming from there. That requires us to think pretty differently about the world than just nations and borders, right? We have to think about food supply chains and mass migrations and new kinds of settlements. And this is just the final nail in the coffin in the argument, as if the internet and connectivity and infrastructure and economies and migration weren't enough cause to believe that the world is reorganizing itself. I mean, here's the sort of icing on the cake. We will just have to. And this is even absent rising sea levels and coastal inundations and potential tsunamis having a devastating impact on the world's coastal megacities, particularly in Asia. So we could be in for, obviously not a stormy and turbulent time. People always talk about that. But think about the consequences for what we do the next day and the next day and the next day. And it's going to require, again, rethinking how we organize ourselves. And that's kind of what this is all about. So I'm probably going to stop right there. I'm just wondering if there's one pretty map I can end on. Oh, of course, it's this one. We might toggle between this and the next one a lot since we're here at Google, a foremost technology company. What I got telegeography to do for me here is to map out bandwidth speeds within and across the continents and to update their data so you could get a sense of where global connectivity is going, because of course the value of the services trade in the world system is now greater than the value of goods trade, and Google is of course part of making that happen with things like the Fiber One cable and even the cables that are being laid down across the continental United States and providing faster bandwidth to American communities. This gives you a sense of how much more we have to go, because you can see that even though the populations that are online in Asia are so significant, and even in Africa, the percentage of the populations that are online is still not where it could be, right? So in India and China, it's hovering around 40 to 50, 60%. So not at the level where you see Western Europe and the United States and Japan and South Korea, where it's 100% or more. So this is, I know, a mission that a lot of key technology companies play. And having traveled around and looked so much at the catalytic impact that connectivity has, whether it's energy, transportation, or communications, I strongly believe in that connectivity sort of mission. Oh, there's all this good stuff about genetics too, which is in the book, but we won't get it. We'll just leave up this peaceful map of the world's intercity networks, and we'll invite Yasmin back up, and we can talk about maybe some of the other maps as well. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and especially today. Thanks.
Thanks, Parag.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a fascinating presentation. I didn't want it to end, and I think we went in the right direction with pretty pictures. Mm-hmm. We like maps, we like data at Google. All right, so we have 20 minutes. I thought maybe I could steal 10 minutes to ask you a few questions that are burning on my mind, and then we can have 10 minutes of Q&A with the people who are with us. I thought I'd start with cities. Mm-hmm. You've been thinking about cities for longer than most other people I know. You've been talking about cities for a long time, before it was cool. Mm-hmm. Now you're talking about...
cool anymore.
It's cool, it's very cool, it's very hot. Megacities, megalopolises, would that be the plural? Megalopoli.
Let's go with that.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think about cities, and we do, being part of Google and part of the tech sector, we do think a lot about China and the US, and we compare China's approach and the US's approach to governance and to structure and to strategy. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how you think the Chinese and the Americans are thinking about cities.
Sure, and we shouldn't forget the Europeans. Because what Europe has centuries of history and is sort of pedestrian, walkable, dense, and mid-size urban environments that are actually more sustainable, right? So China has obviously vastly overshot that given its huge population. It's gone out of its way to build these more gigantic industrial size, but then again, it's still an industrial society or economy, whereas the Western world is more post-industrial. So China takes a lot of its inspiration, I would say, or its efforts today from Europe, which is to say how to implement more sustainable technologies in these urban environments that they've realized have become horribly congested and polluted and so forth. What you find in these Chinese clusters is that you'll have one or two or three core cities, and then each of those will have little satellite towns, and then each of them will be connected into sort of by high-speed railway networks and highways, and then each of those clusters, like I said, is connected to the other clusters. So you get really like this, crystalline kind of structure, and that's how it's emerging. Now, in the U.S., of course, there's no such strategy behind.
Because there's a strategy with China, that's the point you're making.
It is a strategy. I mean, China is the only country. So urbanization is an organic phenomenon around the world, right? It is one of these irrevocable megatrends in the same way that connectivity is. The way I put it, there's two irrevocable megatrends across sort of time and history today. One is this connectivity, and the other is urbanization. You bring the two together, and you get this map of the world. So around the world, people organically, voluntarily are flooding into cities. China is the only place where it's happening both voluntarily and involuntarily, because they're dictating and directing and steering people into new cities that they've built that are empty. There have been a lot of media reports that call them ghost towns, but then you go back after 4 or 5 years and they're starting to fill up because people are looking to move out of places that have been wiped out as the manufacturing sector has collapsed and wages have risen. So they're moving into these new towns. And a city, to remain economically viable, in terms of its services sector, or having a resilient services economy versus being dependent on manufacturing exports that are highly volatile, you need to have at least 3 to 4 million people, various research suggests. So the problem with many American cities is that their populations are below 1 million people. So you take Detroit. Detroit's population fell to below 1 million people, and it lacked that internally resilient services economy that would allow it to sustain itself beyond the export-oriented automobile industry. So we need to re-aggregate our cities in a way that they can be internally viable. And so the way I describe Detroit's future in this New York Times piece is that it should be seen as the midway point on a Chicago-Toronto corridor within this broader North American Union. That's just not the way Congress people think. I mean, we are a long, long way from our Congress, which of course, everything is about fighting for, fiscal and budgetary scraps to go into your state, not caring about whether or not that infrastructure connectivity stretches across one state boundary to another so that you can mutually benefit. We are down here when it comes to the sophistication of our political logic and stretching beyond our state boundaries. Meanwhile, what I'm proposing is, right, it makes total sense. Just look at a map. Chicago, Toronto, and Detroit in the middle. You should be having a trade and industry corridor that's an export powerhouse taking advantage of like Arctic shipping routes through Hudson Bay. In Washington, they can't even find Hudson Bay, right, on a map. And I wish I weren't exaggerating. But that's where we need to be. And even second-tier Chinese cities you can go to, they've all got their own economic master plans and strategies. What industries they want to attract? What companies are they targeting? What supply chains do they want to be part of? All of these things, they're thinking way, way, way ahead. Now, there are a number of cities that are starting to do this, like Columbus, Ohio, and Salt Lake City, and the Brookings Institution as a whole department that consults on this. It's starting, but that doesn't mean it's going to succeed. Just like in China or other places in the world, cities get wiped out. In industries rise and fall. People have to move. The beautiful thing I would say about America, the virtue, the luck, the manifest destiny, whatever you want to call it, is that America is so large, so devolved, so federalized, so distributed, has so many large population centers that people can resort when you have these economic convulsions like we've been having. And it's one of the things that people have to sort of take advantage of. I mean, the history of American migration is searching for opportunity in new geographies. And so I think that great resorting, as some economists and sociologists call it, is actually underway today in America. It may seem tragic and painful to see the sort of lack of opportunity in many areas, and the fact that people just have to just get up and go and look for new. But that's actually part of American history. And think about all the countries where you don't have that possibility, where the entire economy centers around one city and nothing else. And if that city fails, if that economy fails, if the one industry that drives it fails, the whole country is screwed. That's never going to happen to America. And America is lucky, but it should actually build the infrastructure to make it more possible for people to make those moves today that are necessary to revitalize society and the economy.
Yeah, you spoke about cities being the only thing that you can see from space, and the thing that we've had for 5,000 years, while the nation states and the Westphalian system are less than 200 years old. Let's imagine that the megacity model in China, and it's exporting it, and let's say the Congress adopts your prescriptions in your New York Times op-ed. What does this mean for the nation state and also for national identity? Many people, Americans, Europeans, Canadians, enjoy their sense of national identity. What happens when the city takes over as the atom and the building block?
Right. So, history is cumulative. It's not substitutive. Nothing that I've said at any point should suggest that nations and states and boundaries and national governments disappear. We're always going to live in some country or the other. The entire world's physical geography is claimed by sovereign states. In fact, there are many geographies that are claimed by multiple states. You will always be standing on territory that belongs to or is claimed by a sovereign government. I've got no problem with that. But history is additive. It's the cities from 5,000 years ago. It's the empires that have existed for thousands of years. America is an empire. Europe has empires that overlap. The European Union is an empire. China is an empire. India is an empire. And then you have the states that are now another layer on top of that. So you have sovereignty, you have enlightenment, you have technology, you have capitalism, you have infrastructure. All of these things just keep on and on layering. So the city doesn't replace the country any more than the country ever replaced the city. These things just make the world more complicated. And that complexity applies to all of us in our identity as well. If you were never able to connect to anyone outside your national boundaries, if you had no access to information, if you couldn't leave the country in which you were born, you would have a relatively limited sort of, selection of identities to choose from. That which is prescribed by the king, that which is prescribed by the pope, whatever the case may be. That's not the case anymore. And so what I find, especially in a world that is very young, right? I mean, 40-50% of the world's population is young and youthful, and and a large share of the world's population is also old. But when I travel around and I talk to young people, what I find is not a sense that national identity is the only identity that matters to them. It's not something you have to reject in order to appreciate and absorb and embrace the multitude of identities. So I talk in this book about civicism, which is a sort of newish term coined by a friend of mine, in which he says, the pride and loyalty in a city. People say, of course, if you're a New Yorker like I am, you're a New Yorker first, right? There's lots of places in the world.
How old were you when you moved to New York?
I was 6.
Okay. So you get to say you're a New Yorker.
Yeah.
No one disputes that you're a New Yorker.
They dare not.
Okay. Because I want to know how long it would take me to be a New Yorker.
Look, so let me just say something actually about this, because this is a city that right now, in Albany and elsewhere, they're actually discussing whether or not to give migrants, non-citizens, voting rights in municipal sort of elections. So, to vote for mayor of New York or in city council sort of ballots and referenda. I think that's awesome. Obviously, you're a New Yorker if you're able to vote. You could be someone who is not even naturalized. You could be an illegal alien who is just in some way sort of given some identity card, and you might be able to participate in the politics of the state. The U.S. You will not be voting for president for a very long time, but the politics of the city you're going to be part of. I think that's incredible. Only cities like Rotterdam and Toronto and Hamburg and New York and other places are actually starting to do that kind of thing, because they say, like ancient Athens, by the way, just going back to the history of cities, where there was residents, any resident of Athens was part of the polity of Athens, right? And there's nothing so radical about that coming back today. One of the biggest sections of the book is actually about devolution. It's about cities and provinces and reclaiming their right to govern themselves, because that's where the decisions are made, that's where lives are affected, that's why mayors are becoming so powerful, that's why when someone like Bloomberg entertains running for president, so many people take it seriously. That's why there are more presidents today, active sitting, serving presidents today, whose last job was mayor of a big city, than ever before in history, because that's the stepping stone to proving that you actually know how to run something. So again, I don't view these things as so civicism is one new kind of identity beyond your national government identity, your religious identity, and then there's all the identities that you acquire through technology, right? The whole field of social physics, right, as it's called, is about understanding how people now form these cloud communities, right? What is your identity in the cloud? Not just, what's your avatar's name, but how do you feel about the communities that you're a part of online? People who have a certain cause, Arab democracy, environmentalism, you name it. That identity can be very strong too. And so I don't think that one has to substitute the other. We have to embrace this complexity. Each of us has many identities that overlap.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. I will, because we have less than 10 minutes, so I will allow anyone here to ask a question now. Go ahead.
Thank you for coming. I have a question, kind of a counter view on this. One was I was thinking that you've mentioned the maps in terms of the city and linking the cities and the cities growing and kind of encompassing the core of connectivity, people and pipelines, infrastructure, electricity. I have kind of the counter view. I was thinking, like, really, I was thinking in terms of, like, things are kind of diluting away from cities in the sense that given that connectivity has reached every part, everyone has a phone now, even in, say, India, in my small city where I was born, and now even rickshawala has a phone, right? He doesn't earn enough, but he has a phone. So that means that everyone, if they wish, can learn and become a service, can trade their services. So that means we don't really need them to come to services. So people should kind of go away from cities and start, I should see a more uniform lighted map, which I was kind of hoping to see in the book, but I said, oh, no, that doesn't make sense. I was thinking, like, oh, maybe all the bulbs will light up everywhere, and then it would be homogenized. So at some point. Right. And another one I was thinking was that the 4 degree centigrade increase where like most of South America and India was kind of flooded and gone. That seems to me that don't they have mud in the Himalayas? Can they like carry and put them on the sides and then they stop the water from like dipping New York City? Just keep dumping mud from Central America and put them on the sides of New York City. They built Dubai just by shoving mud into water.
It was a little bit more complicated than that. But that said, land reclamation is one of the themes in this book. I talk about sand, the role of sand. There's this global market for sand that gets shipped and towed all over the world to build up artificial islands. So obviously you see this happening in the South China Sea. And I actually say, think about how much the United States spends on, missiles and submarines and aircraft carriers and sort of, fighter jets and so forth. And China is using sand silica, the most abundant element in the Earth's crust, which it's free, is now the most powerful geopolitical weapon. China just takes this sand, dumps it onto rocks, and is able to claim new political sovereignty in very sensitive environments. So it's a lesson learned. But let me take your first question. I've heard this many times. If all it took to convince people not to move to cities is to give them even a solar-powered charged mobile phone, then I don't know why they would move to cities. And the truth is, you don't just move to a city because you really want to get a Nokia phone, right? You go there for healthcare, you go there for jobs, you go there for education, you go there for basic services, for income, to send remittances back to experience, modern life. Which are things that you're not going to get. You're talking about connectivity as if it's just digital connectivity. But the fact is that the instance of malaria falls drastically if you have a hardwood or concrete floor in your home, which many billions of people do not have. A mobile phone is not the same. A mobile phone does not cure malaria, right? So you will, as I say, never, ever stop people from moving to cities, ever. There's nothing you can say, there's no amount of fiber cable Google or anyone else can lay down to the remote villages where, of course, it makes no economic sense to lay down cables to because there's no one there. You will never stop urbanization. Only massive tsunamis drowning the billions of people urbanizing on the Pacific Rim is going to stop urbanization. So you can't convince people that just because they have a bunch of phones in rural environments that life is better where they are, because if that were true, they wouldn't be coming. Again, this is a voluntary process, and it is as much or more so in India than anywhere else in the world, which is, of course, the most rapidly urbanizing country on the planet is India, even though they have exponentially accelerating mobile phone penetration, right?
My question is slightly different from this one. Seems like is it right to say that basically we are just becoming one civilization? If yes, then historically, civilizations, they end up collapsing, and most of the time in a spectacular fashion. What makes us different?
Right. On the question of civilization, I think it is the first time when you can speak of something like this global network civilization. It's not a terminology that we could have used before. But civilization in the sense of those that rise and decline in, as you say, in these spectacular moments of collapse, that tends to be an anthropological, ecological, and political pattern with respect to specific geographic, cultural civilizations. I'm using civilization, obviously, in a much looser sense of the ability for mankind to have a certain minimal degree of connectivity amongst its parts, so that you can think of it as having some kind of cohesion. You never would have been able to say that many generations ago, or certainly not centuries ago. The notion that we are all in this boat together, so to speak. You didn't hear people exactly talking like that in the 19th and even in the 20th centuries. So that's the sense in which I mean civilization. And of course, again, a lot of it rests on this physical connectedness. You can't influence, and you have much less sympathy for that which you can't touch and feel, that which you're not connected to. One of the examples I give in the book is the collapse of that garment factory in Bangladesh in the year 2013, where there was an uproar for months and months and years because there was a Bangladeshi garment factory making clothing for Western retailers, and there was this uproar saying, H&M and Zara and these other companies, what are you doing about this? What are you doing about the plight of those people? I mean, can you imagine that happening like even 10 years ago, 15 years ago? No way. It's because the supply chain connects us here in rich New York to the poorest people in the world. And so we're able to have some degree of sympathy or empathy with them. That never, ever, ever could have been the case. And previously, if it were the case, the anti-slavery movement, for example, I mean, it was obviously more emotive and more geographically specific. But now you can find these connections through the supply chain between almost any two people in the world. So, and then again, that process is just now getting underway.
final closing note, I wonder if you could say something that speaks maybe to, you are here at Google, maybe to those of us in the tech sector who think about connectivity probably in only one aspect of the way that you tackle it in this book, but the tech sector is thinking about driverless cars and aerial delivery systems and AI and assisted, automated assistants. We're laying down cables. Yeah. We're big on connectivity. What would you leave us with as a kind of, the promise or the opportunity for technology's role in connectography?
So I point out in the book that telecom companies, technology companies are infrastructure companies, and obviously Google is foremost among them in terms of literally contributing this physical built infrastructural environment, to which I say amen, because we're desperately lagging in that category across the board of, again, energy, transportation, communications, that what we've been, what's called the infrastructure stock, right, has been so meager for a world of 9 billion people. So Google, as well as, very large companies like, pipeline companies and railway companies are all agents of connectivity. And so they're actually, in a way, the heroes of this book, are those that facilitate, enable, and expand connectivity, because we have been able to demonstrate as far back as the Industrial Revolution that it is connectivity that has lifted global living standards, that has enhanced trade. There have been enough Nobel Prizes given out for this, by the way, going back to Michael Spence, Angus Deaton, Robert Solow. You can't disprove the notion that connectivity is the agent of growth in the world economy, and it's all forms of connectivity. So even if governments aren't doing it, if the private sector is, I think that's a fantastic thing. And that's not just for countries, that's for people, right? We can measure now everything from how your labor productivity improves by being digitally connected. We know that, in terms of the workforce around the world. So in every way, connectivity I think of as not only something that has this empirical role in strengthening our capacity and our productivity, but it really should be a human right. In this book, connectivity is presented as a human right as much as anything. Connectivity and mobility should really be considered two of the absolute foremost human rights in the world. And I can't think of any instance in which it is not a good thing for a human being to have the option to be more connected or more mobile. And so if you want to talk about improving mankind's fate, you definitely want to extend that connectivity to everyone you can. So, congrats for doing so.
Wonderful note to round off the talk. Thank you very much, Parag Khanna.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Hooray.